She was half dead when the sheriff found her, bleeding, breathless, stuffed inside a pine coffin like a cursed relic from a sin long buried. Her dress was torn, stained in earth and memory. Around her neck hung a rusty tag that read, "Property." In the lawless silence of that border town, women were sold like cattle, used, discarded, and buried in plain sight. But this one, this broken, whispering soul, refused to die quietly. When the sheriff leaned in to hear her final words, her cracked lips trembled, and what she whispered didn't ask for help. It offered him salvation. He thought he'd seen everything: blood, betrayal, the cruelty of men, but nothing prepared him for the truth sealed behind her eyes. She wasn't a ghost. She was the wound this town tried to forget. And somehow, saving her meant facing his own damnation. In the vast dustlands of the Old West, where justice was sold cheaper than whiskey, a dying woman's breath would ignite the fire that could burn the sins of a generation. If she lived, if he stayed, and if both dared to believe in something neither had known before: mercy. Sheriff Elias Boone had buried too many names to remember. Out here, under the scorched sun of Arizona territory, the law was a fragile thing, much like Elias himself. Hardened by years of hunting outlaws and watching hope rot in the hearts of men, Elias had grown silent. Not cruel, just tired. He lived alone, far from the buzz of saloons and judgmental stares, in a wooden cabin that creaked like his bones. To most, he was a ghost with a badge. But inside, there was still a man haunted by one mistake, one fire he couldn't put out. Her name was Clara, though she hadn't spoken it in years. Ever since the day she was dragged into a leering crowd and sold like livestock, her name had died on a stranger's tongue. Clara had known only walls and commands since then. Her eyes, once green as prairie spring, had dimmed to storm gray. Yet her soul had never surrendered. Not entirely. When Elias lifted her from that coffin, he expected death. Instead, he met a gaze that demanded something else: remembrance. She wasn't just another victim of the Old West's cruelty. She was a mirror, and she was about to change everything. In the brittle chill of a western dawn, the town of Deadwood Hollow stirred like a beast nursing its wounds. Morning light crept through broken shutters and across dust-caked streets, where wanted posters flapped like prayers forgotten. Sheriff Elias Boone walked with the stiffness of a man who had buried more than he'd saved. He wasn't searching for redemption. He no longer believed in it. But when the undertaker stumbled into his office, pale and muttering about a coffin that breathed, Elias knew the desert wasn't done with him yet. The journey to the graveyard was quiet, but the silence was heavy, like it knew what lay ahead. The pine box was real, crude, nailed shut, half buried behind the chapel. Someone had tried to hide it fast. Elias unscrewed the lid with hands that had once dug graves of their own. Inside, beneath layers of torn fabric and blood-soaked cotton, lay Clara. At first glance, she seemed dead, a casualty of another lawless night in a land that devoured the innocent. But then, as if pulled from some defiant spirit within her, she stirred. Barely. Her whisper was cracked like old leather, but her words, "Don't let them find me again," struck the sheriff like a bullet through the ribs. That moment didn't feel like rescue. It felt like consequence. Clara's skin bore the map of cruelty, scars, brands, and bruises that no law ever touched. Her wrists, raw and bound with dried leather, told stories Elias didn't ask to hear. But her eyes, they didn't beg, they accused. She was the product of a place where women were paraded like trophies, auctioned in barns and backrooms, labeled as property under the guise of frontier order. Leilón de Mujeres wasn't just a shadow in this land. It was a business, thriving in silence. And now, one of its ghosts was breathing in his arms. He didn't take her to the doctor. Elias knew better. Some wounds couldn't be healed by stitches. Instead, he carried her across barren hills to his cabin on the edge of nowhere, a place where no one came unless they were ready to vanish. There he cleaned her wounds with whiskey and silence. Days passed. She didn't speak much, and neither did he. But in the stillness between them, something strange began to form. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition. Two broken lives orbiting the same abyss. She watched him like one might watch a fire, dangerous but warm. And he treated her like a secret he didn't deserve to keep. At night, Clara dreamed aloud. Names, screams, a girl named Lily. Elias never asked who she was. He simply sat nearby, gun in hand, as if guarding her from phantoms he couldn't see. Each day, Clara grew stronger. Her limp faded, her voice steadied, and her silence thickened. Elias knew she was holding something that might damn them both. And yet, he didn't push, because deep down, he understood what it meant to carry guilt like a shadow. He too had failed someone once, and the price of that silence had cost him everything. What neither knew was that Clara's return to the world would set a fuse that had been buried for years, and once it lit, there'd be no turning back. The day Clara picked up Elias's rifle and looked him in the eye, everything shifted. Not because she wanted to shoot, but because for the first time, she wanted to defend. Him, herself, whatever it was they were becoming. And Elias, watching her framed by the fading western light, realized this wasn't just about hiding anymore. The past was coming, with blood and fire and the names of men who never expected to see Clara breathe again. Clara awoke one morning with her palms open to the rising sun, as if the warmth could cleanse the memories buried in her skin. The cabin smelled of coffee and old wood, and Elias was already outside, chopping logs with the precision of a man who needed to sweat out ghosts. She watched him from the window. Not just his movements, but the way he looked at the horizon, as though waiting for something that never came. She didn't know yet that Elias once wore a ring he never spoke of, or that the ground he stood on held secrets deeper than bones. Inside her, a storm brewed. Each quiet hour in the sheriff's cabin pulled at the stitched seams of her past. She had been branded not only by iron, but by betrayal. Sold by someone she once called Uncle. Promised protection, only to be dragged across county lines and paraded before drunken ranchers like a prized filly. The night she escaped, if that's what it could be called, was a blur of fire, a broken fence, and the distant sound of her own name turning to ash. She had fled into the desert with a bullet in her thigh and shame like a shroud. The coffin had not been a prison. It had been sanctuary. Elias saw the way her hands trembled when he reached for the water jug. He noticed the way she flinched at sudden winds, as if expecting the sound of hooves behind them, but he didn't press. That wasn't how healing worked. Out here in the lonely corners of the frontier, silence was sacred. He mended fences, gathered supplies, and built a second room onto the cabin, no questions asked. And Clara, for the first time in years, began to reclaim pieces of herself. She sewed, she hummed, she walked barefoot along the creek without looking over her shoulder. And though the ghosts were still there, they no longer screamed. One evening, as the sky turned the color of bruises, Clara found an old mirror wrapped in cloth beneath Elias's floorboards. It was cracked, like everything else in that house, but it reflected enough to show her something unfamiliar. Herself. Not as property, not as prey, but as a woman. Her hair had grown, her eyes were clearer, and the sackcloth she once wore had been replaced with Elias's flannel shirt, tied at the waist. She touched her face, not with vanity, but with wonder. She was becoming someone again. Not the girl she had been before the Leilão de Mujeres, but someone stronger. Someone dangerous to the men who once owned her. But safety in the West was an illusion, and pasts, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of unearthing themselves. One morning, Clara spotted a hawk circling above the ridge, a sign she had learned to fear. It meant movement, outsiders. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she stood at the window, gripping Elias's revolver. When he asked what was wrong, she finally said it. They'll come. One day. For me. For what I know. And when they do, they'll burn everything. Elias didn't argue. He simply nodded, loaded his rifle, and said, Then we'll burn them first. The first rider came at dusk, alone, silent, trailing a cloud of red dust like a herald of war. Clara saw him before Elias did. She recognized the posture, the rhythm of the reins, the arrogance carved into every movement. This was no traveler. This was a scout, a message without words. She didn't speak as Elias stood beside her at the doorway, rifle in hand. The man never dismounted. Just looked at the cabin, then turned and rode back into the horizon. The message was clear. We know. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She folded her old sackcloth gently, tied it with twine, and placed it on the mantel like a relic. Elias watched, not asking why, because he already understood. What once was shame had now become armor. In the days that followed, Clara trained. Not with rage, but with purpose. Elias taught her how to shoot with precision, how to ride with silence, how to track men by the scars they left on the earth. In return, she told him her story in fragments, how the man in the black vest, named Ransom Greeley, ran the most brutal lay loan de Malaire's circuit west of the Mississippi, how he once locked her in a shed for 6 days after she refused to smile for a buyer, how she'd escaped only because Lily, her sister by blood or soul, it never mattered, sacrificed herself as a distraction. Clara had run. Lily had never been seen again. Each confession felt like a bullet to Elias's chest. He had heard stories, sure, but never with such clarity, such raw, undiluted horror. And with every detail, something inside him cracked open. He saw Clara not as someone broken, but as someone reforged by fire. A living testament to the brutality of the frontier and the silent revolution of survival. She wasn't just a victim of violence against women. She was a voice no one had dared to hear. A reminder that behind every saloon tale and cowboy ballad, there were bones buried in silence. They started planning. Not to run, but to strike. Elias had maps of old mining trails, hidden canyons, and outlaw havens. Clara remembered faces, habits, tells. Together, they began to craft a revenge, not of wrath, but of justice, a justice long overdue. They sent letters through backroad traders, coded messages to former deputies Elias once trusted, and to one woman Clara remembered from the auctions, a firebrand named Belle who now ran a refuge in Kansas under the name of the Daughters of the Dust. A storm was forming, not in the sky, but in the veins of those who had suffered too long. One evening, as the sun sank like blood behind the mountains, Clara stood in the doorway wearing the sackcloth veil over her head, not in shame, but in defiance. Elias approached, heart caught in his throat. She turned and whispered, I won't run anymore. And for the first time, Elias Boone, the ghost sheriff of Deadwood Hollow, took her hand, not like a rescuer, but like a man standing beside a storm, unafraid of the flood. Behind them, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and reckoning. The letter arrived wrapped in a red cloth. No return name, no stamp, just dust and a blood-like seal. Clara knew before opening it. Belle had answered. The message was brief. We're coming. 10 days. Hold the fire. Clara read it twice, then held it to her chest. It wasn't just reinforcements. It was a lifeline. Somewhere out there, other women remembered. Other survivors had risen from the ashes of the Old West to reclaim something sacred, justice, dignity, and they were riding for her. Those 10 days were sacred. Elias and Clara lived in a strange kind of stillness, preparing traps along canyon paths, digging hidden caches of ammo, and carving escape routes beneath the root cellar. But in the quiet moments between war, they became something more. Elias showed her his mother's locket, the only thing he'd kept from his old life. Clara confessed that Lily used to sing to her every night, even when their stomachs were empty and their futures were already sold. They shared stories not as nostalgia, but as rebellion, proof that they had lived beyond survival. The desert, harsh and unrelenting, became their cathedral. Each sunrise was a psalm, each bullet a prayer. The 9th night brought lightning. A storm cracked open the sky, splitting the dark with white fire. Elias and Clara sat on the porch, rifles across their laps, rain washing the dust from their faces. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't think that's the right question." She looked at him, eyes searching. "Then what is?" He turned toward her, solemn as scripture. "Will it be worth it?" The silence between them answered louder than words. They kissed, not as lovers seeking passion, but as warriors sealing a vow. When dawn came, it brought more than light. Hoofbeats, dozens. Elias raised his rifle, but Clara touched his arm. "It's them." Across the ridge, women emerged like ghosts from the red dust, armed, fierce, many wearing pieces of the same sackcloth Clara had once worn. Some rode alone, others in pairs. One carried a rifle with a ribbon tied near the trigger, Lily's ribbon. Belle dismounted first. Her eyes scanned Clara, and in that moment, without words, 1,000 lifetimes of pain passed between them. Belle nodded. "Time to bury the past," she said. "Let's start with Ransom Greeley." Elias led the war council inside the cabin. Maps were spread, names were spoken, strategies whispered like incantations. Belle's intel had tracked Ransom to a ranch north of the border, fortified, but not invincible. And in 3 nights' time, he was set to hold another auction, another Leilon de Muleres. Another scar carved into the soul of the West. But this time, the women wouldn't be silent. They would ride with fury and fire, not to reclaim what was taken, but to end what should never have begun. As the sun fell, Clara tied her sackcloth veil once more, not to hide, but to remember. They rode at nightfall, the sky burning orange like a dying fire. Clara led the front line, her eyes fixed, her heart a furnace. Beside her, Elias carried the weight of every soul he'd failed to protect. And behind them, a legion of forgotten women reclaimed their names in silence. No one spoke as they crossed the dry riverbed. Their horses moved like shadows, swift and reverent. They were not bandits. They were ghosts seeking burial. Warriors born of ash and silence, riding not for revenge, but for reckoning. This was what the desert had been preparing them for. The ranch came into view at sunrise. It looked peaceful, almost holy. Wide fields, a white barn, a wraparound porch kissed by golden light. But Clara knew better. Within those walls, women had screamed into pillows, wrists chained to bedposts, dreams auctioned to the highest bidder. Ransom Greeley was not just a man. He was a system, a ritual of dehumanization wrapped in the skin of civility, and today they would burn the altar. Elias took position on the ridge, scoped the guards. Clara and Belle moved like smoke through the canyons, flanking from the east. Every step was a heartbeat, every breath a countdown. The first shot cracked the sky like thunder. Elias took down a watchman on the water tower, and chaos erupted. Clara kicked the barn doors open with Belle at her side, rifles blazing, smoke curling around them like wrath incarnate. Screams echoed, not of the innocent, but of the guilty, caught in the judgment they never thought would come. Clara found the auction stage, empty now but still stained. She climbed it, looked down at the trembling man in the black vest. Ransom, older, softer, but his eyes were the same. He smiled like a priest. "I see they made a warrior of you," he sneered. She didn't shoot him, not yet. Instead, she raised her voice to the others. "Bring them." One by one, the captives were led out. 8 women, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. Some sobbed. Others stared, silent and broken. Clara knelt before them. "You are not for sale," she whispered. "Not anymore." Belle tossed her a rope. Ransom's smirk faded. Elias appeared behind him, gun drawn. "You remember Lily?" Clara asked. Ransom said nothing. Elias pulled out a photograph, water-stained but intact. Lily's face, smiling, forever 15. "She died so Clara could live," he said. "Now you'll live knowing she won." They didn't kill him. They left him tied to the stage, weeping, surrounded by flames and the faces of those he once owned. As they rode away, the barn burned behind them, a funeral pyre for centuries of violence. No one looked back. Clara rode beside Elias, veil trailing behind her like smoke. In her hand, she held the same tag that once marked her as property. Now it hung from her saddle, bent, scorched, meaningless. Ahead of them, the road was dust and silence. But within them, something sacred had been rebuilt. The desert was no longer a tomb. It had become a cradle. The ride back to Deadwood Hollow felt like moving through another world. The air was still, heavy with the scent of charred wood and spent gunpowder. The women, though bloodied and tired, rode taller. Clara no longer looked over her shoulder. Instead, she watched the horizon as though the land itself might answer her silent questions. Belle parted ways with a simple nod. "You know where to find us," she said. Clara squeezed her hand, no words necessary. They had become something more than survivors. They were living myth, each one a verse in a forgotten gospel of resistance. Elias and Clara reached the cabin by dusk. It stood untouched, but something had changed. The place felt less like a hiding place and more like a home, earned, not borrowed. Elias unpacked the rifles while Clara stepped inside, tracing her fingers along the wooden frame of the doorway. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was trespassing in someone else's life. She took off the veil and folded it neatly, not to forget, but to honor. That night, they didn't speak much. They sat by the fire, side by side, hands close but not touching, and in the crackle of embers, they heard their pasts begin to dissolve. Clara began writing letters. Not just to Belle, but to anyone who had once been like her, girls in dusty towns, wives traded like goods, daughters who vanished into silence. She signed each letter not with her name, but with Lily's. "Let her name be a lantern," she told Elias, "even if no one remembers her face." Elias watched her, and in her resolve, he saw his own healing. He'd spent a lifetime thinking redemption was about making amends. But maybe, he realized, it was about giving others a reason to believe again. In something. In someone. In themselves. Weeks passed. The cabin grew fuller, not with people but with life. Flowers bloomed by the creek. Clara hung blankets she'd woven. Elias built a rocking chair and sanded it until his hands bled. They weren't pretending the world had changed, but within their corner of it, something sacred had taken root. She still had nightmares. He still carried the weight of too many lost souls. But they held space for each other in those dark moments. They were no longer haunted. They were human again, flawed, healing, whole. One morning, Elias walked in to find Clara wearing a white linen dress, barefoot on the porch, veil in hand. She turned slowly. "I don't want a church," she said. "I want this, you, the wind, the sky." He understood. He reached for his mother's locket and placed it in her palm. "It's not much," he said, "but it's all that's never left me." Clara fastened it around her neck, then tied the sackcloth like a bridal veil. The same veil once soaked in dirt and blood now fluttered in the wind like a banner of rebirth. And when they stood beneath the open sky, hands joined, it wasn't a wedding, it was a resurrection. News travels slow in the West, unless it's wrapped in fire. Word of the burning auction house spread across counties like a storm on dry leaves. whispers of a woman in sackcloth leading an army of survivors. Tales of a sheriff who turned against his own kind to protect what the law ignored. Some called them outlaws, others called them saviors. But in the quiet corners of the land, where women still lived behind locked doors and girls still flinched at footsteps, Clara became a legend. Not for the gun she carried, but for the truth she spoke without words. Strangers began arriving at Deadwood Hollow. Not many, just one at a time. A bruised girl with a cut lip. An older woman holding the hand of a child, not her own. A pregnant teen whose father called her a burden. Elias and Clara never turned them away. The cabin grew too small, so Elias and a few former deputies built a second one, then a third. The dry land bloomed not with crops, but with memory and defiance. They called it Hollow's Rest, a place for those with nowhere else to go. A whisper of freedom in a land that still sold women by the pound, but every spark draws wind, and wind calls fire. Ransom Greeley had survived the blaze, and though his empire had crumbled, his hatred had not. He hired bounty hunters, men who didn't care for the reasons behind bounties, only the weight of the coin. One of them, a tracker named Jed Scaleback Marin, had never failed a mark, and now he carried Clara's name on a blood-stained sheet of parchment, pinned beside Elias's. Dead or alive, it read, preferably dead. The past, it seemed, wasn't done with them. It had just changed its face. Clara felt it before Elias did, the eyes in the distance, the unease in the horses, the silent question in the air. She began preparing again, not just weapons, words. She started writing her story, fully, without fear. Every name, every scar, every stolen night. "They want to kill me," she said one evening, "but they don't understand. I've already died. What's left of me is fire." Elias said nothing, just took her hand and kissed the place where her old brand had faded. They weren't preparing to die. They were preparing to be remembered. One dusk, while training a group of new arrivals to shoot, Clara spotted movement on the ridge. Not Bell, not allies, men, armed, watching, waiting. She turned to Elias, eyes steady. "They're close," she said. He nodded. "Then we hold." The valley around them grew still. Even the wind seemed to wait. The storm wasn't coming. It was here. And this time, it wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about legacy. They came at nightfall, under a moon veiled by smoke. 10 men, silent, hardened, trained to kill and vanish. Jed, Scaleback Marin, led them like a hound on scent. They moved through brush and stone, surrounding Hollow's Rest like vultures. But Clara had been ready. The lanterns were dimmed, children hidden in root cellars, rifles loaded, blades tucked under floorboards. She wore no veil now, only a scarf tied at her waist, Lily's ribbon stitched into it. Elias waited by the chapel door, his shotgun resting across his knees like scripture carved in steel. The first shot was a warning. The second drew blood. By the time the third echoed across the valley, the battle had begun. It wasn't a siege. It was a reckoning. Elias moved like he had decades ago, before guilt made him heavy. Clara fought beside him, not as a woman out for revenge, but as the voice of every silenced soul. Bullets tore through fences and prayers. One attacker set fire to the grain store. Another tried to break into the schoolhouse, where the youngest girls were hidden. Clara took him down with a shot to the spine. No hesitation, no apology. Jed found her in the orchard, stalking like a wolf through the trees. "So you're the one," he growled. Clara didn't respond, just raised her weapon. But he was faster. They struggled in the dust, fists and fury and fire. He slammed her into a tree. She struck him with a rock. His blade tore her arm. Her nails left his cheek bloodied. "You were born to be owned," he spat. She looked him dead in the eye. "And you were born to be forgotten." Then Elias's bullet tore through Jed's chest from 50 yards away. Clara fell to her knees, shaking. Elias reached her seconds later. "I told you," he said, lifting her. We burned them first. The remaining attackers fled or fell. The fires were smothered, the blood buried. No one from Hollow's Rest died that night, but something did end. Not just the threat, not just the past, but the idea that silence was safety. The next morning, Clara stood before the community, arm bandaged, face bruised, soul alive. She read from her journal, names, stories, truths. "This is not just my story," she said. "It's ours, and it does not end in shame." They wept. They rose. They began to build again, not just cabins, but a future. Later that day, Clara placed the bounty notice on the chapel wall, not as a warning, but as a memory, a reminder of what had been survived. She took Elias's hand, led him to the ridge, and together they watched the sun rise over Hollow's Rest. He turned to her. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" She smiled softly. "No, because this is what comes next." And as the wind moved around them like a hymn, they understood. The past had tried to bury them, but they had chosen to bloom together. Years passed, and the legend of Hollow's Rest grew like wildflowers in forgotten graves. Travelers told stories of a town built by the broken, guarded by a ghost sheriff and a woman who once rose from a coffin to light a fire across the west. Some believed Clara had died that night in the orchard and been reborn by the will of the desert itself. Others said she carried the spirit of every girl lost to the silence of dust and steel. But those who found their way to Hollow's Rest didn't come seeking legends. They came for the truth and stayed for the healing. Clara and Elias never chased peace. They cultivated it. In long days of building, in quiet nights of reading letters aloud from women they would never meet. The sackcloth veil was framed and hung inside the chapel, not as relic, but as scripture. The locket Elias once carried became Clara's symbol too, passed to others as a rite of belonging. In a land where names were taken, they gave them back. In a world that prized power, they offered protection. What they built was not a sanctuary. It was a revolution disguised as home. One day a young girl arrived at the edge of town, barefoot, face streaked with soot. Clara met her at the gate, offered water and a blanket. "Do you have a name?" she asked. The girl shook her head. Clara smiled gently. "Then we'll start with that." And just like that, the cycle of forgetting ended. Elias watched from the porch, his hair now silver, his hands still calloused from work. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew the world outside hadn't changed. But here, in this dust-wrapped corner of history, something sacred had taken root and would not be moved. The West never wrote their names in books. There were no medals, no monuments. But the truth of who they were, of what they endured and gave, was carried in every woman who learned to ride, to fight, to reclaim her own story. Clara and Elias had found each other in a coffin and in silence. But they stayed for something greater. A love that was not loud, but lasting. A bond not built on rescue, but on rebirth. If you believe in stories like this, where pain becomes power and broken people build unbreakable legacies, then this is your place. Subscribe for more tales that echo across the dustlands, and tell us in the comments, what part of Clara's journey spoke to you the loudest?